The bell above the door hadn't worked in 3 years, but Emmett Dawes still heard it in his head every time he walked into a place like this. He stood in the doorway of Crawford's Pawn and Exchange on a Tuesday morning in late October, rain soaking through the back of his collar, and looked at the glass cases full of other people's necessities. Wedding rings, power tools, a saxophone with a dented bell. The saxophone bothered him most. Somebody had played that thing. Somebody had loved it. He walked to the counter. The man behind it, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a name tag that said Dale, looked up from his newspaper and did what people always did when they saw Emmett Dawes. He took in the worn Carhartt jacket, the mud on the boots, the gray stubble coming in uneven on a face that had lived outdoors for most of its 61 years. Dale decided something in about 4 seconds, the way people do, and whatever he decided, it wasn't flattering. Help you? Emmett set a velvet pouch on the glass counter. Small, navy blue. He didn't open it right away. Looking to sell something, he said. Most people are, Dale said, and went back to his paper. This is the part nobody talks about. Not the decision to walk into the shop. Not the drive over or the night before, lying on top of the covers staring at the water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Arkansas. The part nobody talks about is the 30 seconds at the counter before you open the pouch. When you can still leave, when it's still yours. Emmett opened the pouch. He set it on the glass carefully, the way you'd set down a sleeping child. A distinguished flying cross, silver. The citation etched on the back had worn smooth in some places from 30 years of handling, but the eagle on the front was still sharp, still precise. Dale looked at it over the rim of his glasses. Then he looked at Emmett. His expression shifted. Not much, but enough. Where'd you get this? I earned it, Emmett said. Cobar Towers, 96. You can look it up. Dale picked it up, turned it over. We don't see many of these. I know. I can give you $40. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Emmett didn't move. He looked at the medal in Dale's hand, his medal, his name on the citation, his 2 tours in the Air Force, his 18 months of flying medevac missions in the Gulf when he was 29 years old, and believed without question that what he was doing mattered. And he thought about the water bill, and the electric bill, and the medication for his sister Verna, who had nobody else and whose pharmacy didn't do payment plans. 40, he said. It's not a military memorabilia shop, Dale said, almost apologetic. Almost. I'd have to find the right buyer, hold it for months maybe. That's the risk I'm taking. Emmett looked at the saxophone again. He thought about whoever had played it. All right, he said. He didn't say it loud. He said it the way you say something when you've already made the decision 3 days ago, and the moment itself is just paperwork. That's when the other man spoke. He'd been standing at the far end of the counter, maybe 15 feet away, looking at a case of old wristwatches. Emmett hadn't paid him much attention, younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing a Postal Service jacket with the logo faded from washing. Dark skin, big hands. He had the kind of stillness about him that you either earned or were born with, and most people weren't born with it. Sir, the man said. Not loud, not rude, just clear. Emmett turned. I couldn't help but see what you put on the counter. The younger man walked over slowly, hands visible, the way people who've dealt with police learn to move. He looked at the medal, then at Emmett. Is that a DFC? It is Air Force? Yes. The younger man was quiet for a moment. He looked at Dale. What'd you offer him? Dale's jaw tightened. That's between me and... $40, Emmett said. He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe because he was tired of things happening in the dark. The younger man closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Just one. Then he opened them and looked at Emmett with an expression that wasn't pity. Emmett had seen pity, and he hated it. But something more like recognition, like someone looking in a mirror they didn't expect. My name is Jerome Watts, he said. I did 8 years Army, 2 in Mosul. He paused. Please don't sell that. Son, Emmett said, not unkindly. I appreciate what you're saying. But I've got. How much do you need? The question stopped everything. Dale looked up. Emmett looked at Jerome Watts and tried to figure out if he was being mocked. He'd been mocked before in subtler ways by people with softer voices. But Jerome Watts's face held nothing like that. It held something much harder to receive. It held sincerity. I'm not asking for charity, Emmett said. I'm not offering charity, Jerome said. I'm offering to buy it from you, for what it's worth. Not what he's offering. You can't. I've got $212 in my checking account, Jerome said. I just picked up my paycheck. It's yours if you need it more than I do. The rain ticked against the front window of Crawford's Pawn and Exchange. A car went by outside, slow headlights cutting yellow through the gray. Dale had stopped pretending to read the newspaper. Emmett Dawes had grown up in Pritchard, Alabama, the youngest of 6, in a house where the heat sometimes got cut off in January and you wore 2 pairs of socks to bed and didn't say anything about it at school because complaining was something you did inside the family or not at all. His father had done 20 years in the Navy. His mother had worked the register at a grocery store for 31 years and known every regular customer by name. He had learned from both of them that there was a way to accept help and a way to refuse it, and that knowing which was one of the more important skills a person could develop. He looked at Jerome Watts. "What would you do with it?" Emmett asked. "The medal." Jerome thought about that. "Honestly, I'd probably just hold on to it until I figured out how to get it back to you." Something moved through Emmett's chest. He couldn't have named it exactly. It wasn't quite gratitude, and it wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite relief. It was something that lived in the space between all three, something that didn't have a word in English, possibly in any language. "I don't need $212, Emmett said. "Okay, what do you need?" Emmett looked at the medal on the counter. He thought about Verna's prescriptions, the water bill, the thing he hadn't let himself calculate too clearly, because some numbers, once you write them down, become real in a way that's hard to come back from. $80 would cover the immediate situation, he said. Jerome Watts reached into his jacket pocket and counted out 4 20s without drama, without performance, the way you hand someone an umbrella when it's raining. He set them on the counter next to the DFC. "Take your medal," he said. Emmett picked it up. He put it back in the velvet pouch. He stood there holding $80 of Jerome Watts's paycheck and felt the weight of it. Not the money, but the other thing. The invisible thing that passed between people when one of them decided that a stranger's dignity mattered. "I'm going to pay you back," Emmett said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Jerome nodded, because he understood the difference. Dale, behind the counter, said nothing. He picked up his newspaper. He found a different page. Outside, the rain was letting up. Not stopping, just softening, the way October rain sometimes does in the late morning, like it's run out of urgency and remembered it has nowhere to be. Emmett and Jerome stood on the sidewalk in front of Crawford's, both of them looking at the street without speaking, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that forms between people who've been in situations where there wasn't time for small talk, and who've never quite lost the habit of skipping it. "You live around here?" Jerome asked. 20 minutes south, Emmett said. "You?" "I'm on my route. Got another 3 hours." He glanced back at the shop. "I come in here sometimes looking for watches. My grandfather collected them. I don't know why I still look. He's been gone 4 years. "I know why," Emmett said. Jerome looked at him. "Because looking feels like talking to him." Jerome was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what it feels like." They shook hands. The grip held a beat longer than a casual handshake. The way it does when people recognize something in each other that they rarely get to acknowledge out loud. Emmett walked to his truck, a 2003 F-150 with a crack in the passenger side mirror that he'd been meaning to fix since 2019, and sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. He sat there with the velvet pouch in his lap and looked out the windshield at the gray street. He thought about the first time he'd earned it. December of 1996, a building turned to rubble, and him in the helicopter coming down through smoke and prayer into a landing zone that wasn't supposed to have been a landing zone, and the flight surgeon next to him saying something that might have been a curse, and might have been a prayer, and might have been both. 3 people came out of that building who would not have come out without that helicopter and that crew and every decision they'd made in the preceding 12 seconds. He'd never told anyone that. Not the full version. The official version was in the citation. The real version lived in his sternum, behind the left side of his rib cage, right next to where his heart still beat with more regularity than he probably deserved. He drove south. He stopped at the pharmacy. He paid for Verna's prescriptions. He still had $40 left. He drove to Verna's place, a small brick house on Clement Street with a rose bush by the door that she refused to let die no matter the season, and she let him in and put on coffee and didn't ask why he looked like he'd been somewhere difficult, because she'd known him for 58 of his 61 years, and she'd learned to read him the way you learn to read the sky before weather comes. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm okay," he said. "That mean you're okay, or that mean you handled something?" "Both," he said. She set a cup in front of him, sat across the table. Outside, a dog was barking at something 2 yards over, the kind of bark that started with conviction and lost interest halfway through. "Verna," he said. You ever have somebody do something for you that you didn't know how to respond to, right?" She thought about it seriously, the way she did most things. "Leon Pickett," she said, 1987. "My car broke down on I-65 and he stopped and changed the tire in the rain and wouldn't take a thing for it. I offered him money. He said no, I offered him my number." She smiled. "He took that." Emmett laughed, actually laughed, the full kind, the kind that came from low in the chest. "Why?" Verna asked. "A young man let me keep something today," Emmett said. "He didn't have to. He didn't know me. He just decided it mattered." Verna wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at her brother the way she'd looked at him across every kitchen table in every house they'd ever shared. "People surprise you," she said. "Not often enough," Emmett said. "No," she said, "but often enough." Jerome Watts finished his route at 4:17 in the afternoon and drove home to the apartment on Decatur Street that he shared with no one, which he'd gotten used to in the way you get used to things that aren't quite comfortable by simply continuing to live with them. He ate dinner standing at the counter, leftover rice, and whatever was in the cabinet, and thought about the man in the pawn shop. He'd thought about him all afternoon, not in a heavy way. More the way you think about a song you heard once in a waiting room and can't quite identify. Something keeps returning. He'd gone into Crawford's looking for a watch like the one his grandfather used to wear. A Bulova automatic, nothing fancy, the kind you wound yourself and that made a sound like a small, satisfied heartbeat. He'd never found one that felt right. He didn't know if one existed anymore or if the rightness he was looking for had less to do with the watch than with the wrist it used to sit on. He thought about what the man had said. Looking feels like talking to him. Jerome Watts had not cried since Mosul. He was aware that this was not a healthy fact. He'd been told as much by a VA counselor in 2019 and a girlfriend in 2021 and approximately nobody else, because approximately nobody else had gotten close enough to the inside of him to notice. He didn't cry now, either, standing in his kitchen eating leftover rice. But something in him loosened, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling against it and simply leave it alone. He thought about his grandfather, who'd never served, never wanted to, who'd worked 34 years at the water treatment plant in Huntsville and coached Little League on weekends and could name every player on every World Series roster back to 1955. Who'd called Jerome every Sunday until he couldn't anymore. Who'd told him once, just once, in the car, on the way to somewhere Jerome couldn't even remember. Some Saturday errand, some nothing afternoon that had turned out to be important. The best thing you can do for another man is let him keep his dignity. Everything else is commentary. Jerome Watts stood in his kitchen and thought about Emmett Dawes, who'd earned a distinguished Flying Cross pulling people out of rubble in 1996, and who'd been standing at a pawn shop counter on a Tuesday, in October being offered $40 for it. And he thought about the look on Emmett's face when he'd said, "Take your medal." Not the gratitude which was there, but the thing underneath the gratitude, the thing that looked like a man remembering who he was. That was the part Jerome kept coming back to. He put his plate in the sink. He sat on the couch. He texted his cousin Marcus that he'd be at Thanksgiving, which he'd been putting off confirming for 3 weeks. He set his phone face down on the cushion and let the apartment be quiet. Outside, the October rain had finally stopped. The streets were still wet, and the streetlight caught the water on the asphalt and made it look like something worth looking at, the ordinary kind of beauty that mostly goes unnoticed because people are either moving through it too fast or too tired to lift their eyes. Jerome Watts lifted his eyes. He didn't know if he'd ever see Emmett Dawes again. He'd thought maybe he would, had thought it in the parking lot, standing in the last of the rain, watching the old F-150 pull out of the lot with more care than a man takes with a truck he doesn't love. He'd thought that someone who'd find a way to pay it back, not because it was owed, because of what kind of person he was. The kind who said, "I'm going to pay you back," and meant it in the deepest possible way, which had nothing to do with money. 4 weeks later, Jerome Watts found a Bulova automatic at an estate sale in Decatur. Not exactly his grandfather's, close enough to be its cousin. He bought it for $22 and wore it home and listened to it tick on his wrist the whole drive back. That sound like a small, satisfied heartbeat, and thought about how strange it is, the way things find their way back to you. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes. Sometimes in a pawn shop on a Tuesday in October, when the rain is coming down and the saxophone in the case has a dented bell and a man you've never met is about to give away something he should never have to give. And the only thing standing between him and that moment is you, and the $40 in your jacket pocket, and the voice of your grandfather in the back of your mind saying, let him keep his dignity. Everything else is commentary.